So I was sitting here trying to figure out what story I was going to do in addition to the Justice League Dark story based on the Justice League Dark. But I was I was sitting here thinking, Doctor Strange comes out this week, and Doctor Strange does like weird stuff. I mean, there'll be a lot of other Doctor Strange, like the 2 volumes from Marvel Now, or Marvel All New, All Different Marvel, and there'll be, you know, Doctor Strange versus Doctor Manhattan, different things like that, you know, and there'll be cool stories. But I wanted to do something Halloween inspired because it's Halloween week here at Comics Explained. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, well, there's Marvel Max. Did Doctor Strange ever have anything to do with Marvel Max? And he did. There is a story with Thor. Now, for those of you guys who do not know, Marvel Max is Marvel's adult-oriented lineup. The great thing about this is that this does not include a lot of gratuitous nudity, so we can get away with it on my YouTube channel. The bad thing is that if you were wanting to see like boobs, you're not going to see that in this video. Having said that, this story is written by Garth Ennis, and in my mind, Garth Ennis is like the king of Marvel Max stuff, right? Like, he did the whole thing with Punisher Max, which is an amazing line of stories. We will cover those as best we can once we get to the actual like Netflix series of the release of the Punisher, but we've got to be weary because Punisher Max is pretty dark and there's a lot of really hardcore stuff that goes on there. But this basically features Doctor Strange and Thor teaming up to fight Vikings. So it's about as badass as it gets. But what we do here is we initially pick up in this weird land on the west coast of Norway. And it's like this guy named Harold Jackelson, and he runs this Viking troop. Now keep in mind, this is back during the days of the Vikings. So this is something like 1000 AD. And they've basically pillaged and they've laid waste to this small little town. And their goal is to basically do what the Vikings did back then, which is just travel around, conquer stuff, and just pillage stuff. It was a pretty interesting life. But the fact remains here that because of what they've done, they're basically cursed by what they consider to be the old wise man of the village. Now, there's going to be a bit of a continuity error with this story that I hope you guys will be able to pick up, but I'll also mention it as well. But as you know, Harold Jackelson and his forces begin to leave on their ship, this wise old man basically calls them cowards. You know, he tells them that, you know, they are basically going to die the straw death. Now, we'll get into what the straw death is later on, but he effectively just calls them cowards, says they're men that would attack women. And so he takes this relic and he cuts his arm with it, and he uses his blood to basically curse them. Now, of course, the Vikings shoot him because they're Vikings, and that's what you do when you're a Viking. You shoot people that say mean things to you. And as a result, he dies. But while he lays dying, his blood seems to continue to touch this thing. Now, the curse that he laid down was that for 1,000 years, they would sail the seas, but they would never find the land they sought. And so what this does is it basically keeps them on the water for 1,000 years. They're literally just surfing the oceans. Now, Garth Ennis kind of leaves it to us to interpret how this works, right? You know, because if there were a Viking ship that were sailing in the oceans for 1,000 years, somebody somewhere would have noticed. Like someone, you know, when sonar came about and when there was radar imaging and as technology progressed, like someone in the military somewhere would have said, sir, there is a Viking ship like 1,000 feet away. But for whatever reason, and presumably as part of the curse, no one ever noticed it. In addition to this, the Vikings themselves also watched as time passed. As the years passed, we saw, you know, the Titanic, they passed that. As the years went by, they passed an aircraft carrier, until finally they land in 2003, which is when this story was written, in modern day New York. Now, when they get here, of course, because they're, you know, Vikings, because their goal is to literally rape and pillage, that's exactly what they do. And we're gonna find out these guys take no quarter. I mean, as soon as they show up on the shore, some guy who's really curious about what's going on, one of the people who believes it's some kind of reenactment, goes to see what these guys are about, and he immediately dies. He gets stabbed in the head. And from there, Jackelson says, go out and do your thing. And so they literally go through, I mean, they're like a plague cutting through the city of New York. They go through and they take out everyone. They kill cops, they attack various women, they kill almost anyone they come across. But for Jackelson, for him, it's really strange here, because he comes across in the way it's described. This is one of the great things about Ennis, is he describes it the way that Jackelson sees it. And so the question is, you know, these are silver towers, you know, made of metal and wood. How does all this come together? How does this work? You know, they don't really know how to relate to these cars, but for them, it still doesn't matter. Not only that, it seems as though Jackelson and his forces have been imbued with some measure of abilities, because Jackelson picks up a car and sends it flying. Now, the indication here is that because of the fact that they were Vikings when all this first set set sail, that they were normal people. So most likely this curse that was imposed upon them did something to manipulate them or to change how it was that they existed or something along those lines. But while they're in the midst of preparing to have their way with a young girl, Thor suddenly appears. Now, when I was reading through this, I was like, okay, this is gonna get awesome. Like Thor's gonna show up, he's gonna bust him up with his hammer, they're all gonna die, and then like some opposing force is gonna show up, like some giant entity or something like that is gonna make its appearance, and it's gonna be this great big huge conflict. Instead, that doesn't happen. The interesting thing about this, and this is actually what's really kind of funny, is Jackelson knows who Thor is. Because of the fact that Thor is as much, a god as he is a legend to the Vikings, to that part of the region, they know who Thor is, the son of Odin, a god and that kind of thing. But Jackelson doesn't care. He's just like, whatever, the son of Odin, I don't care. And the reason why is because when Odin goes to attack, he hits Jackelson with his hammer, but Jackelson seems almost completely impenetrable. Not only that, the impact broke Thor's arms because of the fact that Thor basically hit an unbreakable object with his hammer. His arms absorbed the impact and broke the bones. And so it's just like, Jesus. I mean, like Thor broke his arms hitting a guy with a hammer. And so Jackelson basically just starts taking it to Thor. While his forces are going through New York, they're killing everyone they see, they're decapitating them, putting their heads on pikes, so on and so forth. Jackelson is going through and just wrecking Thor. Not only that, he's doing it in one of the best ways that I've ever seen. He's talking smack like you wouldn't believe. He's saying things like, am I gonna have to keep smacking you like a wench? Basically calling Thor a coward, telling Thor that he's a woman. Now, Ennis also injects, a lot of humor into this, because Ennis is really good at taking dark humor. He's really good at giving us something to laugh about, even if we might feel a little bit bad about doing it. But we have circumstances where news reporters are sitting in their newsrooms, they're reporting on everything that's going on as news anchors, and then Vikings are breaking in and chopping their heads off. We have guys who are sitting at bars who are watching this event unfold on TV, and the Vikings are coming in and they're just lopping their heads right off, and they're just killing everybody inside of the building. And so what happens is with Thor and Jackelson, it's clear here that Thor is completely outmatched. I mean, Thor can do nothing to this guy. Jackelson also knows the legend of Thor with regards to his hammer with Mjolnir. And so Jackelson knows that he can't really pick it up. And so what he does is he basically just takes Thor, takes the last few pot shots at him, makes fun of him, tells him to go die the straw death, and then just takes his ship and decides to go park it on top of the Empire State Building. In addition to this, the various police forces that are available in New York, whether it is the National Guard, whether it's the actual Marines that are being called in, regardless of the circumstances, they're all being completely obliterated. And so what we do is we basically have this scenario where Jackelson is conquering the entirety of New York City. And so the question we have is, where are the Avengers? Where's everyone else? Where are the superheroes that would normally be here in this situation? Because when I was reading this story, that was one of the first things I thought. I was like, well, if some force comes in and completely incapacitates Thor and just sends him, at least seemingly to the depths of the ocean, they're killing everybody in New York. Where are the Avengers, man? And don't tell me they're off planet. And so what we do is we pick up with Thor as he's mustering what little strength he has left. Now, again, something to keep in mind here is that Thor does have a pretty advanced healing factor. In terms of how it relates to like Wolverine and the Incredible Hulk, I'm not 100% sure. In truth, I've never really had a reason to look up his healing factor because more often than not, he's usually always kind of like the big gun. He's one of the big guys that you call in to solve the problems. And so you don't really see a lot of scenarios where Odin's son is beat within an inch of his life. But I would say, of course, because he's part of Asgard, he can be killed, but he's also able to heal himself, through just normal means of being a god. But the fact remains is that while his injuries are recovering, he's suddenly met by the arrival of Doctor Strange. Now, of course, one of the first things that we also get in addition to this is a meeting with the mayor. And this is when we start learning about the Avengers. Because of the fact that the city's been completely overrun, the mayor was one of the first people to bail out. He was one of the first people to get out of there and to take off. The issue with this is that while the mayor is talking to reporters about how they're expecting the Avengers to arrive, the Avengers said they're going to be there shortly, he's suddenly hit with a spear from from probably 20 miles away, which is an insane distance. But what we also do is we pick up with Thor and Doctor Strange. Now, of course, Thor asks the question that we ask. And this is one of the other reasons why I like Garth Ennis is because he's so good at taking us as the reader and figuring out one of the first things we would ask and then answering that in the comic book itself. Ennis is really, really, really good when it comes to that. And that's exactly what happens here, because my thought was, well, if Doctor Strange is just now showing up, then why wasn't he there before? And in fact, Doctor Strange says, hey, look, man, I was watching your fight with Jackalson. You obviously got wrecked. We need to find out what's going on here. And so in addition to this, Doctor Strange also asked the question, what's the straw death? Now, this is one of the cool things that Ennis says when he talks about expanding on the cultural aspect of comic books. And I think that's a really important thing, because I think in the realm of comic books, it's very easy to just skip past cultural elements and just talk about the big things, like this thing happened and this thing happened and that happened. With regards to the culture of Thor, that is to say, the warrior's creed, culture, Thor comes from a belief system, not just of Asgard, but of that region, that the warrior's way is the way to live, that if you're going to die, you die fighting. That's just how it is. You die in battle. The glory of battle is what allows you, into the afterlife, is what allows you into Valhalla to live among the other great warriors that died before you, and to see those warriors that will travel to Valhalla who die after you. And the idea of dying a straw death is the worst circumstance for a warrior, because it basically means you die in a straw bed. You die cowering in fear from a battle, as opposed to actually living out and dying in a major conflict. And so for Thor, it's really just an insult. To say go die the straw death is to basically say you're a coward and you're going to die as a coward. And that's exactly what happens here. In addition to this, something else I hope you guys notice is that Doctor Strange is very cavalier with regards to all the things that's going on. Now, Ennis really throws this to us for a couple reasons, and some of it is really kind of left to our own interpretation. Historically speaking, Doctor Strange exists in two forms. There's what's called pre-retcon Doctor Strange, and then there's what's called post-retcon Doctor Strange. During the pre-retcon era of Doctor Strange, he was wildly powerful in terms of the things that he was capable of. If there was something he needed to do, there was a spell book for it, and he had the ability to do it, whether it's traveling through time, making himself immortal, granting himself any superhuman power, controlling reality, communicating with the cosmic entities. I mean, it was insane the kind of things that he could do. But what happened was a storyline was written, and I can't remember the name of it for the life of me, but there was a storyline that was written that saw Doctor Strange losing his connection to the Vishanti, which are like his main energy source. And because of this, you had Brother Voodoo, who took over the role of Sorcerer Supreme for a time, and then Doctor Strange got his connection back, but it was with less power than he had before. And it was just a way to decrease him. It was, during that time period of pre-retcon Doctor Strange, he was suffering from the Superman complex. How do you write a story about a guy that can do anything? And so by reducing his powers, it made him weaker, it made him more vulnerable, it was easier to kill him, therefore it was easier to write stories where he would always be on the edge of death. And that's one of the reasons why he was able to last as long as he did, but it's also one of the reasons why he struggled too, because people really liked the super powerful Doctor Strange. But the fact remains here that with the various magics that are available to him, of course, what he says is we have to find out what it was that happened that led to these guys not only appearing here, but also possessing a level of strength and durability that could withstand an impact from the hammer of Thor, as well as allow these guys to completely incapacitate Thor just through sheer physical strength. And so what Doctor Strange does is he takes Thor to this weird kind of nexus area, which has it has a time flowing like water. Now on its face, this does seem a little weird. Admittedly, it does seem a little strange, but the reason why Garth Ennis does this is because it gives something tangible. Within the realm of Marvel Comics, different concepts are depicted differently. For example, there's no true definitive hell in Marvel Comics. You have hell for Asgardians, which is where they go when they die if they don't go to Valhalla, but you also have like the realm of Mephisto, which is kind of hell, but not really. That's where people go whenever they've made a pact with Mephisto, and then he comes to collect their souls when that pact is complete. There's all these different iterations of locations that are all really just interpretations of existing areas, if that makes any sense to you guys. But when it comes to abstract things like time, the barriers between dimensions, the best way that comic book writers know how to give this to us is something we can relate to. And in almost every single example that somebody uses when they talk about time, they say time flowing like water. Time flows forward. Time doesn't flow backwards. And so with this particular instance, what this does is it basically gives us something that we can grab onto. It's Garth Ennis telling us that time's flowing like a river, it's flowing forward. But not only that, it makes it easier for him to relate to us what it is that Doctor Strange is doing. And what Strange is doing here is he's basically saying we can basically follow this current back to a certain point in the time stream, and we can find out what happened that led to these guys appearing here. And when they do, they of course follow themselves back to the original situation where this wise old man had cursed these Vikings to whatever curse it was that he gave them. Now, what Doctor Strange also does is he expands on this and he says that the device, the artifact that guy was holding, was rune magic. It's very tricky to use, but it's also very powerful. The reason why this is such a big issue is because rune magic within the realm of Marvel Comics, and Doctor Strange even says this, rune magic is only something that should be used by the most experienced. The reason for this is because if it goes wrong, it could be disastrous. This is one of the reasons why, for those of you guys who read the Thor Ragnarok story, this is one of the reasons why when Thor became, or I guess Odin's son became God King Thor and was insanely powerful, he was a multiversal entity in terms of his power, he had to go through all the steps that Odin went through to be able to know what this power is before he could even access it. And even when Odin originally learned about that power, about the power of the ancient runes of Asgard, Odin chose not to use it because that power was so extreme. Now granted, the circumstances of Thor Ragnarok required it in the sense that Thor had to face off against the ones who sit above in shadow and so on and so forth, which I have a video on that you'll find down in the description. But the fact remains here that Doctor Strange says that because this old man had invoked rune magic, not really knowing how it works, that what was supposed to happen is he was supposed to cut his arm and put a little bit of his blood. But the amount of blood that goes onto the rune is directly proportional to the strength of the curse. Because of the fact that the guy had died and had basically bled out onto the rune had effectively absorbed the entirety of his blood, basically his life essence, everything that made him who he was. And so because of this, these guys are 1,000 times more powerful than they should have been, which make them wildly more powerful than Thor. Now, the issue with this is that Garth Ennis doesn't give us like a basis. He doesn't say these guys are 1,000 times more powerful than this person. He just says the curse is 1,000 times more powerful than it should have been. So we know that they're more powerful than Thor in terms of strength, durability, and so on, but like we don't know how they would relate to like Hulk in his angriest form. We don't know if Hulk would just keep fighting against them until it got to the point where he was so angry that his strength would just override the curse that these Vikings are experiencing. We don't have the answer to that, and in truth, we don't really need it. This is really just Garth Ennis telling us this curse is the reason why these guys are this strong. They've literally been sailing for 1,000 years, and you know it's 1,000 years worth of life basically built up inside of them. So it's almost equating life to power, so to speak. And by saying that they have 1,000 years worth of life, that they have 1,000 years worth of power built up inside of them. It's really kind of weird here. And, Garth Ennis doesn't really tell us exactly what he means by that. But at the very least, what Doctor Strange does is he hypothesizes and he says, okay, if this curse is tied directly to the blood of the wise man who invoked it, and the wise man's dead, and it's against the rules of time for us to go back and keep the old wise man from dying, then the only thing that we can do is follow his bloodline. And this was the plot contradiction that I was telling you guys about. If the old wise man hailed from a village where everybody was killed, then the question is, where did his offspring come from? Garth Ennis doesn't answer this. Garth Ennis doesn't say, well, he came from a different village and he had kids there, and then that's where they came from. He just talks about his offspring. But this is one of those things that we just kind of overlook for the sake of the story. We see that a lot in comic books. Writers will just kind of skim past things. They won't answer some questions simply because it's not wildly important. It just gives them a way to wrap things up. It really ties into the element of comics should be enjoyed. Continuity is not that important of a thing when it comes to a story like this. But the fact remains here that Doctor Strange basically takes us and Thor on this journey to meet these various offspring of the old wise man. The first one that we come across is a girl named Sigrid. Now, the funny thing about Sigrid is she's considered, of course, because she's a woman among this tribe, she's not considered nearly as capable as the men. Now, this is just a cultural aspect of this tribe at this time. They just didn't take women as seriously as men. Women weren't allowed to fight like men. The funny thing is that one of the guys starts running his mouth and then Sigrid kicks his ass. So I guess she is as capable as guys are because that guy that guy walked away with a dotted eye and a bruised ego. But what we also do is we find that Doctor Strange had basically taken her and whisked her away while she was in the midst of a conversation with her father about how she always wanted to see battle, she always wanted to see conflict, she wanted to prove her mettle. And we get this a couple more times. The second person that we get is the Magnus of the Danes. Now, Magnus of the Danes is fighting among the Crusades, which is the war, that took place for, well, actually, I think there were like 3 or 4 different iterations of the Crusades, but it was basically a religious conflict. And Magnus of the Danes is fighting on behalf of Christianity, killing off all those that he perceives to be unchristian according to the existing Catholic belief system. And so again, much like Sigrid, he's basically whisked away, which sends us to 1945 during World War II. Now, the guy that they get, which is interestingly enough, a Nazi, the guy they get actually has odd allegiances, and we'll find out how his allegiances lie later on. But he's a very capable pilot. He's very exceptional in his ability to fend off against incredible forces and an extreme number of allied forces. And as a result, he's whisked away alongside the other two, Sigrid and Magnus. And so what we do here is we jump back to New York, and we have the Avengers who have joined into the conflict. The problem is that the Avengers are getting wrecked. They're getting absolutely destroyed. Like Captain America's like, medic, for God's sake, medic. But what we also find out is that the United States government is considering every feasible option. I mean, they've literally sent Marines into the city. Now, as far as I'm aware, the War Powers Act kind of does, but kind of doesn't allow the United States Army to do that. But I'm not wildly knowledgeable about the War Powers Act, but I will say that having these soldiers stationed in New York doesn't make any difference. Every last one of them are killed off by the forces of Harold Jagelson. And so again, we jump back with the forces of Thor and Magnus alongside Eric and Sigrid. And Eric has a very hard time coping with this situation. He's basically saying, like, so you're telling me that you took us from 3 different eras in time to come forward in time to fight some Vikings from 1,000 years in the past that are somehow powerful now because of ancient rune magic, and we're here because we're from the bloodline of the guy who originally invoked the curse. Doctor Strange says yes, and he says, okay, this is weird. And so this is, again, just Garth Ennis giving us a little bit of humor here, but it's also the small things that go into it as well. For example, there's a scenario where Magnus of the Danes and Sigrid are looking at the plane of Eric, and Sigrid initially believes that it is an eagle made of iron that's been captured and tamed by men, whereas, you know, Magnus of the Danes says, no, it's a craft that's powered by sorcery, that's powered by devilry, which again is just really funny because we know it is an airplane, and it uses the product of manipulating motion, manipulating air current in order to travel in a particular direction. So, you know, it's just funny to see these people from different eras in time looking at how things function in the moment, but not really being sure of it. And so what ends up happening here is Doctor Strange basically takes blood, or takes invokes magic using the bloodline of each of these people, blends it together, and has them drink a potion. And what this potion does is it allows the curse to more or less be impacted onto them only insofar that it puts them on an even keel against these forces of Jagelson and all the guys that reside under him. So it's more or less just evening the playing field. Now, what we also find out is that Jagelson himself has, for the most part, fashioned a kingdom, in the sense that he's had a multitude of people executed, he's had them dismembered, and he's had their bones turned into a throne for himself. And again, this is just Garth Ennis being dark, but this is the kind of thing you see when it comes to the Marvel Max properties. There really isn't a lot of holding back here. There's a lot of violence, a lot of things that you wouldn't normally see with regards to a traditional Marvel comic book. Having said that, once they're imbued with this ability to fight against the curse of Jagelson and his forces, of course, Sigrid and Thor and Magnus of the Danes and Eric, along with Doctor Strange, immediately transfer, or I guess, teleport to New York and start going through and killing off all these different forces. So really, Ennis is just wrapping this up super fast. He's really just kind of bringing this to an end really quick. You of course have Eric, who's using his ability to fly to face off against this flying ship, and he's doing what he can when he can. But again, this is really just Ennis wrapping things up really, really fast. But we kind of expected this because it's only really a 5-issue story arc. It's not that lengthy, but at the same time, what he's doing here is he's showing us the battle-hardened element of these various people. And it answers the question, why only 3? Why only grab Sigrid, and why only grab Magnus of the Danes, and why only grab Eric? Well, for one, if we had an army of 1,000 people, it would be strange. It would make the story too difficult to really follow. It would just be a giant swath cutting through all these, and it would take away from the effect of seeing Jagelson defeated. But at the same time, Doctor Strange also says, because these 3 seem to be the bravest of the bloodline. Yes, the bloodline stretched on, with thousands of people stretched across the world, but these 3 seem to be the most capable in terms of fighting, in terms of their prowess within their own given time frames. And so again, things wrap up pretty fast here, in the sense that once these forces of Jagelson are starting to become slaughtered, that Jagelson himself descends down onto the conflict. And for Thor, it's really just a revenge fight. He's really looking to return his honor, because for Thor, being bested in battle is something that he can't tolerate. Of course, Thor is a superhero. Thor is an upstanding guy when it comes to fighting alongside the Avengers. He stands up for what's right. But Thor also has a massive ego, and he really hates to be defeated. which is also kind of a funny situation because it makes for some really interesting stories. But the fact remains here that, you know, for Jackalson, he doesn't quite understand what's going on. He doesn't know why Thor is so much more capable now than he was before, in the sense of Thor being able to stand against him, in terms of Thor being able to face off against him. But for Thor, it's irrelevant. The only issue here is basically defeating Jackalson. And while Thor himself does talk a little bit of trash, in the end, it doesn't matter. And Thor basically punches Jackalson out of the atmosphere. Now, the funny thing about this is when he's punched into space, you know, Eric and Sigrid and Magnus the Danes don't know where he went to. They ask the question, you know, did he escape? Did he take off? And Thor says no, and he doesn't answer. All we know is that that Jackalson's just floating out in the atmosphere somewhere. And so what Ennis does is, again, he moves us pretty quick. He basically tells us that with this mission accomplished, you know, with Jackalson and his forces defeated, that Sigrid and Magnus of the Danes and Eric go back to their own respective time periods. But more so than that, they don't die the straw death. Instead, you know, Sigrid dies in battle. Magnus of the Danes, well, his head's put on a pike, so I don't really know how he died. And then Eric, you know, presumably is killed in an attack. But the fact remains that because each of them, you know, displayed bravery in their deaths, they're basically welcomed into the realm of Valhalla itself. With that being said, we're gonna bring this video to an end. This was actually a pretty fun team up for me to read. I really enjoyed it. It was interesting, but Marvel Max is really kind of hit and miss. Like I said, if you were to read Luke Cage Max, you'll see all kinds of nudity and stuff, and the art's not really that good. But, you know, with something like this, it's really just more violent than anything else. But the great thing about the Marvel Max properties is they're not always violent. It's just that printing something under the banner of Marvel Max, which is actually defunct now, I don't think Marvel does Marvel Max anymore, but printing something under the banner of Marvel Max is basically just allowing the writers to write anything they want to do whatever it is they want to with a particular character. In this instance, we saw Thor in a way we haven't seen before, with his arms broken and with him cussing at people and carrying on. But with that being said, we're going to bring this to an end. If you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button below. If you guys enjoyed this video, drop a like, let me know what you all think, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.